Yeah, the next session is going to be from Nick Murphy, who's a postdoc fellow in Western, working with Murat and several other collaborators, including myself. We've got a great time collaborating. And as people filter in, I'll just also take a moment to just plug the importance of these in-person meetings, because while I've had a chance to collaborate with Nick remotely, it wasn't until last night that I really got to meet Nick. And I think it's no, but it's important, and it makes these kind of the relationship building that we can do here is always important for the development of ongoing and future research projects. So with that little plug out of the way, also as always, remote people who are joining remotely can put questions in the chat. I believe, Manuel, you're going to be monitoring those. Okay, great. And then we'll be open. It's a 10-minute presentation and then Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, Nick, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. I was just saying to Matt a minute ago that I got some career ruining pictures of him dancing just now. Sorry. Steph, do I point it at this thing or back there or? Oh, anyway. Okay, great. Okay, so hi, and thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here in person. And I'm going to talk about the policy of mandated anonymity in deceased organ donation and why it needs to change so we can better support and protect deceased donors' family members and organ recipients. Currently, legislation or policy in most provinces and territories across Canada prevents organ donation organizations from disclosing the identities of deceased donors, family members, and organ recipients to one another. And I'm going to make the case that that needs to change to allow for the development of policy that responsibly mediates direct contact if both sides want it. I'm going to start here to motivate why this needs to be done and why it should be done now. What you see is a screenshot of a Facebook group based out of the US called Donor Families and Recipients of Organ and Tissue Transplants. And if you take a look at the description of the group, you can see that it's designed to help deceased donors' families and the recipients of their loved ones' organs find one another. Here's another one based out of Canada called Canadian Transplant Recipients and Organ Donor Families Seeking Each Other. And here again, if you look at the description, you can see that the sole purpose of the group is to connect stakeholders. Now, there are lots of other groups like this, and not all of them are dedicated just to connecting families and recipients. Others, like this one, function as support groups and information exchange forums. But in these as well, you'll often find pleas for information from stakeholders. Here's a typical one from a person whose daughter received a liver transplant, and she offers a bit of information about the transplant and then says, if you or your loved one could possibly have been her donor, I'd love to hear from you. So why is this happening? First, it's happening because many stakeholders clearly believe that they can benefit from getting to know the people on the other side of their donation story. And second, it's happening because, as I mentioned at the outset, in many jurisdictions, policy or legislation explicitly forbids identity disclosure, meaning organ donation organizations are prevented from sharing identities of stakeholders, even when both sides want it. So that's why they're taking to social media as a recourse. I want to talk a bit about the rationale for the restrictive policy because I think it's important to start by acknowledging that there are some very good reasons behind it. You might be surprised to learn that in the 60s and 70s, it was widely believed that donor families and recipients of their loved ones' organs had a right to know one another, particularly because it was thought that it could enhance meaning for both sides. But then healthcare providers began to realize that there could be some drawbacks to allowing relationships to develop. For example, if an organ recipient passed away, the families who'd gotten to know them sometimes experienced secondary loss. Sometimes the two sides had differing expectations about the relationship. Recipients could experience unwelcome feelings of indebtedness and sometimes felt an increased sense of guilt or anxiety just with the knowledge that someone had to die for them to receive an organ. They might also be drawn into the family's mourning, which could complicate their recovery. And in the worst case, it was feared that emotional or financial manipulation could occur. So risks like those are the reason why jurisdictions worldwide decided to foreclose the possibility of any harms arising by mandating strict policies of anonymity. And sometimes in places like Ontario, they did this through legislation, and other times in places like BC, they just did it through policy. And that well-intended regime was designed to protect stakeholders who were perceived to be especially vulnerable due to their experiences. And for the most part, it's been that way ever since. Now, usually it is possible to exchange anonymized letters through organ donation organizations. But if you look through some of the public Facebook groups that I mentioned at the outset, you can see a lot of frustration among stakeholders over this framework. And what's really clear is that for some donor families and for some organ recipients, getting to know the people on the other side of the story is very desirable. And why might that be? Well, we have some qualitative research to help us understand why. And it shows that there can be some very positive benefits for both sides. For donor families, they're often able to find more meaning in their loss. They're able to find some peace and closure and complete the donor's biography. They're often reassured that donation was the right decision when they meet a recipient, which can help to resolve grief. And many seem to benefit from knowing just a little bit more about the recipient. For organ recipients, the big benefit seems to be the chance to express their gratitude in a more personalized way, which can help to relieve guilt, anxiety, and distress. And they also benefit from supporting the donor's legacy. And there's even a little bit of evidence to suggest that it can help with recovery. These sentiments were echoed by our donor family and recipient partners we worked with on this project. Kim LeBlanc lost her son Tyler in 2011, and Dave Allingham was the recipient of Tyler's heart. A year later, with the help of social media, Kim and Dave found each other and they managed to meet in person, and both described the experience as profoundly healing. It's brought Kim a sense of closure, and Dave describes the opportunity to express his gratitude in person as an important aspect of his journey to recovery. Okay, so we know there are risks to direct contact, and we know there can be benefits. And now I want to get into why it's time to rethink the current regime of mandated anonymity. And here I'll focus on just two arguments. The first is a moral argument, and the second is a pragmatic argument. The moral argument is fairly straightforward, and it's autonomy-based. In the donation and transplantation context, donor families and surrogates are understood to be competent to make major decisions regarding surrogate consent to donation, and transplant recipients are understood to be competent to make decisions regarding major surgery. If they can make these momentous decisions, why on earth do we think they're incapable of deciding for themselves whether they might benefit from getting to know the other side if both sides want it? Competent adults should have a right to decide for themselves. Now, I skip over that argument fairly quickly because for the most part, the moral argument, which has been percolating for decades, hasn't been enough to change policy. Although recently, we can talk about later, we have seen things open up in some jurisdictions internationally, as well as in BC, Nova Scotia, and Alberta. So assuming you're not convinced yet, let's come back around to the pragmatic argument, and that'll bring us back to social media. As I mentioned, in those places where restrictive policies remain in place, stakeholders are taking to social media to find each other. Earlier, we saw a post in which a stakeholder sought to identify a donor by providing some details of the transplant in the hopes that someone would recognize the details. And that's typical of what you see online. But there are also other more sophisticated ways. For example, some donor families will post the anonymous letters that they receive from recipients through organ donation organizations in the hopes that someone will recognize them. And even more sophisticated is the strategy used by the groups I mentioned at the outset. Here, stakeholders are encouraged to enter all details into two spreadsheets, and by cross-checking, users can identify likely donor family and recipient pairs and put them in contact. So people are finding each other, and we know that, and we know they think they can benefit. But critically important to keep in mind is that they're perhaps not aware that they're also unwittingly exposing themselves to the risks that we talked about earlier. So the pragmatic argument is this. The rise of social media is gradually making restrictive policies obsolete. Stakeholders now can and do find each other, and when they do, they might benefit, but they're also exposing themselves to risks, and there's nobody there to support them. We have to address the risks of the new reality on social media because right now it's a wild west. The point is that the concerns that once spoke to the need for restrictive policies now speak to the need for responsible oversight. By no means is our team saying that there should be an end to gatekeeping entirely. Mutual identity disclosure is definitely not for everyone. It's probably not for most. and anonymity should still be a right for those who want it. What we are saying is that there needs to be a framework in place to help protect and support stakeholders, whether they want to meet or not. And now the irony in places like Ontario is that the very legislation designed to protect stakeholders is now a barrier to developing policy that can protect and support them in the age of social media. So our team doesn't have a fully developed policy in mind, but we do think it's time to harmonize approaches across the country so that all stakeholders have the option of identity disclosure. We're calling on legislative and/or policy change, depending on the jurisdiction, to allow organ donation organizations to develop responsible policy for direct contact if both sides independently want it. We think a working group should convene to explore the issue with all stakeholders at the table. And we're envisioning a stepwise approach where research into strategies in other jurisdictions comes before policy is developed and tested. And all this should be coupled with evaluation and consultation of the approach, evaluation of the approach to see how it works and how it can be improved as we move along. Social media has really changed the game here, and we think it's time to face up to that. Whatever the ultimate parameters of less restrictive policies, a balanced approach to donor, family, and recipient contact will help to protect anonymity for those who want it and responsibly facilitate contact for those who don't. Thanks to my colleagues and supervisors who worked with me on this project, Charles Vare, Murat Slesarev, and Michael Ward, and a special thanks to Kim LeBlanc and Dave Allingham, our donor, family, and recipient partners, for their dedication and insight. And just quickly, for anyone who's interested, I have a list of very useful and interesting references that I'd be happy to share. Just let me know. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. That was a great presentation. And are there any questions from the audience? Yep. Come.
I'm going to get emotional. That was an excellent presentation. I think that's an amazing initiative to do. My friend Cindy Steinman lost her son last December, and she's the Canadian.
Oh, really?
Yes, and I've kind of, in a way, like mentored her about, like, I had a table tennis tournament for my son for 9 years before COVID for organ donation awareness. So she had a baseball one for her son this early fall that I went to, that I encouraged her to do that. And absolutely Trillium said to her, well, you can try social media if you want to find, and several people on her site have already found each other in Canada, and it's very heartwarming. So thank you.
That's fantastic. That's really interesting. And it's even just knowing that their personal stories, even in this room of people connecting in that way, is really interesting. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much. We haven't met before. I'm Michael Corey. I'm a pediatric pathologist. So sometimes one of the strategies to build up your argument to bring about change is to think of the sort of the steel man argument. So what would be the reasons why legislative change shouldn't happen, or that things should remain the way they are now? What would proponents of the other side, so to speak, argue for?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really sort of the things I listed earlier, these harms that can arise, and they're real. You know, there's not much qualitative research on this, but there are anecdotal stories of some really bad things happening. And I think that those, I suppose the steel man argument would be, this can be an absolute disaster. It can go very wrong. Now, I think we're in a unique position with this argument, is that the steel man argument is actually can be harnessed to support our argument, because that's the very thing we're trying to avoid. You know, if I'm talking to, policymakers at decision-making levels at organ donation organizations, for example, I've said to them, look, what's going to happen if a disaster story makes it to the media? What's that going to do for donation rates and things like that? So really, it's in your interest to develop policy to avoid that kind of thing. I do recognize that the argument is strong. It's meant to support, it's meant to protect people. But I do think there's a bit of this pendulum swing going on away from this paternalistic thing, that came about in the 60s for very good reasons, now towards a more permissive approach. But I do think that people who are against this should definitely be stakeholders at the table when we're discussing and exploring the issue.
I'm sorry, just to push a little bit, just to ask, how could change where people have autonomy to make a decision, potentially get them into more trouble or risk than the current system now? Like, what might somebody suggest could be a way that these changes that have been proposed could put somebody at increased risk?
You mean increased risk for a more permissive?
Sure, or for them to be in a vulnerable position or anything of the sort.
If I understand correctly, you're asking, why would opening things up put people at increased risk?
Yes, if they're able to make a choice.
Right. Well, our position is that it probably wouldn't put them at increased risk because, I didn't have time to talk about it in the talk, but we're talking about having pre-counseling, mediators involved, sort of third parties, professionals, a cooling off period of 12 to 16 months, requirements of anonymous letter exchange, as well as sort of a consent process and assessments prior to. I think.
Perfect.
I can also just, and we only have time for a little bit more, but just from my role at Transplant Quebec, I can say that this isn't a moral argument. It's more the pragmatic arguments like Nick was mentioning, but having the manpower, the human resources to do all that is going to be an issue because our coordinators are already very stretched. And I don't know who in our organization we would assign to this role unless we were to hire or to pay outside consultants. It would be a major burden because, at the risk of making a disparaging comment against a group of people, Nazi sympathizers sometimes sign their donor cards as well. And those meetings might not go well. And so having a mediator there is going to be important. So that's something that we need to be able to have the infrastructure to support. It's not a moral argument, but it is a pragmatic one.
I am on the job for that.
Thanks for a great talk. My name is Blaine Mearside. I'm a surgeon from Sick Kids and Toronto General. I just want to make a point that I think we build these walls, not just amongst donor families and recipients, but also for medical care teams. And so I think, we have a very unique job. There is no field in medicine in which your utility is totally predicated on the fact that somebody or somebody's family has decided to do something good for somebody else out of the goodness of their own heart, right? And it's a really unique place in medicine to be. And we often lose that, because we build this idea that medical care practitioners as part of the transplant team can have very little contact with donor families. And it's not the only, there are other models. And so one of the notable examples is the University of Wisconsin, where when they send their donor teams to hospitals for organ procurements, they meet with the donor families, if the donor families would like that. They explain the process, they put a face to it. And it's incredibly valuable, not just for the families, but also for the medical care practitioners. And so just to make a point that there's, I think, a space in transplant that we need to kind of rethink that, not just amongst donor families and recipient families, but also amongst our medical care teams in which we can have better interface, and it's enriching for both, the medical care teams and the donor families. So we have a very bright line that we've created somewhat arbitrarily that I think we need to think about. So thanks for your talk.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
And thanks for those points. I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it off there. For the people who are online, I know we're already over time. Okay, well, get up there faster next time. Okay, so no,